Thank you very much for attending the talk. I'm going to go through lessons learned implementing a decentralized identity platform. The story is seen from a large-scale enterprise. So my name is Daniel McGrogan. I'm a principal distributed systems engineer with Workday. Workday is a cloud HR and finance company, many thousand customers and tens of millions of users that we need to manage. So identity is a big deal for us, and it's been a big deal for us for a long time. When I was trying to work out how to share the story of our journey through verifiable credentials and distributed identity, it occurred to me that a lot of technical innovation follows the hero's journey. And we heard about heroes this morning, so maybe this isn't as surprising as I hope it was going to be. But as the technology evolves, it follows similar patterns, and we'll go through those. So I'm structuring this as we would the acts of a story. Interestingly, if you take this hero's journey as a circle and straighten it out, it maps to the Gartner hype cycle in an interesting way. So I'll first start by introducing verifiable credentials, the act one of our story, and what we built. Moving on, the lessons we learned through the trials that we experienced and what we built next. Then act three will briefly be the future. So act one, call to adventure. In any story which follows the hero's journey, the hero is living in an ordinary world and they hear a call to adventure. Star Wars is a very famous example of a story told in the hero's journey. So what is it that called us to adventure? What makes us step over the threshold into a new world? Verifiable credentials and digital identity. I'm just going to set the stage a little bit. It's not going to be a technical talk, but it's important that we have at least a cursory, common understanding of what I'm going to be speaking about. If anyone's familiar with this space, or any has even a passing familiarity with it, they may be already familiar with the triangle of trust. This shows the actors in the space and how they interact with each other. So we have an issuer who generates a verifiable credential and shares it with the holder. A holder who has that credential shares it with the verifier. The verifier can then see that the credential is legitimate without interacting directly with the issuer. So these are our actors, and as we can see, the holder is center stage. This is much different to the way we're commonly thinking about how user information is exchanged between parties. So for the rest of this talk, I'll be speaking about our view of decentralized identity. We were using the decentralized identifiers from W3C and the verifiable credentials as from W3C-ish. The easiest way to think about DIDs, or decentralized identifiers in any respect, is that it's an identity that separates control of the identity from a centralized permission authority, which means that it's difficult, or it's possible for people to have total control in a detached sense. And the way that that can be achieved practically is that when you have an identifier, there's a series of associated private keys, cryptographic keys. Control of those keys represents control of the identity. There's a lot more to it than that, but for the understanding for the rest of this talk, when we talk about controlling an identity, being able to control the keys of the identity is really what that's about. Verifiable credentials, then, are cryptographically verifiable statements made by one identity about another identity, and they're signed over by those identities' keys. So this is what they look like. It's a directed relationship. The issuer makes an assertion about a subject. The subject can then choose, if they're the holder, to share that assertion or not. The issuer can write anything they want. It doesn't matter. The subject is then empowered to share it if they choose to or not. The example on the right, I'm not expecting anyone to read or discern. it's just to strip away the magic of the technology. It's JSON, it says a bunch of stuff, and someone signs over it with a key. It's not mind-bending future Star Trek tech. It's something that we can relate to, and you don't need a PhD to understand it. We have many examples of these directed relationships in our day-to-day life. For example, the DMV as an entity makes an assertion that the subject of a driving license is allowed to drive a certain category of vehicle. A university issues a degree, that's an assertion that the subject of the degree has achieved some sort of academic qualification. So again, these are things that we're all naturally familiar with. They're not alien concepts, but they're ways to think about the relationship and the directed relationship of the credentials. So what we built, when we hear the call to adventure and cross the threshold, what does that mean? Well, for an enterprise, it means that we started spending time and money building a solution around the space. And what did we build? We built a software as a service solution to allow administrators to register issuers and register verifiers, define the shape of the credentials that they want to be able to issue and consume, and a way to request credentials from wallets, manage the credentials that they have issued, revoking those credentials. We also needed to create wallets for the end user. So when we began our journey in this space, it was around 2018 where we really started getting into it. And a lot of these hadn't coalesced in the ecosystem. So we found ourselves in a position where we needed to build everything from the ground up. So this is just an example of what that looked like. It's very influenced by the consumer web. It's a very rich user experience. The credential administrator is able to manage their schemas, their verifiers, their issuers, their applications. We also built a tool which let them simplify the mechanisms to create what we called proof requests at the time. It later influenced and fed into presentation requests. So in this example, this is a QR code that would be expressed to a holder of a wallet. The wallet would then scan the credential, or scan the QR code for the request for credentials. The wallet would determine whether it can make the request with the credentials in the person's wallet, and then give them the option to share. Not force them to share, give them the option to share. And this is what the wallet looked like. This was our iOS wallet. It abstracts away the complexities of some of the identity management work and the details of verifiable credential space into a much more user-friendly solution. So, Act 2 of the hero's journey. Act 2 involves setbacks and transformation. The hero can't transform unless they suffer setbacks, or else it's not a journey, they're just fantastic. And likewise, we needed to experience some setbacks in order to transform the way we looked at credentials and what we needed to produce. So this is what I want to share. The lessons we've learned, they're not all negative, they're growing experiences as well. I've separated into two sections, the people and product lessons and the technical lessons. So just jumping straight into it, one of the biggest hurdles we had to overcome was expectations. When you have someone from product approach a technologist and give them a problem, that technologist will find a solution. They will find a way to change a light bulb with a JCB. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct solution. Verifiable credentials only have value. The entire thing only makes sense if you can share the credentials freely. If you, as the holder of the credentials, can share them to any given verifier. If you're developing a use case and you find yourself wondering how to restrict the holder sharing the credential, this is probably not the technology set for you. Distributed identity, self-sovereign identity technology are terrible for monetizing people's identity. Don't try it. You'll turn the technology inside out and upside down trying to work out how to monetize those exchanges. Most identity-based business models for monetizing a solution is one party reaches out to another party, they find some correlation mechanism about a subject, an email address or a phone number or even a name, and then they do an exchange over that. The party is not involved. If we recall the triangle of trust that we've seen, the subject is at the center of the flow, and that completely disrupts that paradigm. So if as technologists or as business people, you're encountering solutions where the people are suggesting that, well, maybe we can charge for the transaction of the credential across in the holder to the verifier, things will fall apart quickly for you. From another practical sense, because the user is the holder, is in the center of the exchange, it's actually really difficult to propagate negative assertions. People aren't obliged to share the credentials. So if you have an assertion such as, if you have a criminal record, give it to me, you're getting no criminal records. You have to invert that question into a positive assertion. Provide me with proof that you have no criminal record. That's where background check companies step in. The ecosystem is also in deadlock. No one wants to stand up a verifier because no one's issuing credentials. Nobody's issuing credentials because no one wants to stand up a verifier. We're beginning to see that crumble. There's movements happening in different large organizations which are pulling these apart. There's been recent movements in LinkedIn, for instance, which should be able to progress some of these elements. It's difficult to get the user to pay for security and convenience of identity. People aren't necessarily familiar with this. People at this conference have varying degrees of understanding of these. You have to have an absolutely enormous value proposition to ask the end user to pay for something like a wallet. And if I was to boil back all of these challenges to maybe something that's overly simplified, is that you cannot sell the technology. You can only sell the solutions the technology enables. We kind of get blindsided by the possibilities of credentials and the possibilities of decentralized identity. But what we really need to think is, how do we enable interesting solutions or novel solutions for problems? And that brings me on to this. So this is the optimistic slide. This is the power use case we found for credentials. And this is King Arthur's Excalibur. This is the X-Wing that blows up the Death Star. This is something that's so impressive that if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope you take this away. You can have a contractor, for example, who has a university degree. The degree is issued to them in the form of a verifiable credential. They have a background check that's conducted yearly, and they also work for a vendor, and they work for the vendor in a casual fashion, so they get a day pass. That contractor now has the ability, in a single transaction, to merge these three credentials. Each of these credentials, when they were issued, has a different semantic meaning. It has a different life cycle. When they got their university degree, they get it once and they have it for life. Their background check, it happens once a year, and their day pass happens daily. Each of the credentials has a different meaning and a different life cycle. The contractor is then able to, in a single transaction, on demand, submit that to something like a site access verifier. The three credentials on the left have been joined into a single transaction on the right with a completely different semantic meaning for an entity that wasn't involved in the issuance of any of these. And we probably look at this and think, okay, that's kind of interesting. When you get into the implementation details of this, and this is a challenge that I'm just going to set out to anyone in the room, think of what it takes to do this with a centralized system. As someone who's worked in the integration space for a very long time, I'm going to use one word: bloody nightmare. And I realized it was two words, but I just felt a bit of emphasis was needed. Types of trust. This is also something that we can do with credentials that is difficult, if not impossible, to do with centralized systems. So if we think about what is delegated trust, let me rewind for one moment. And a very important understanding we need to have on the outset is that credentials themselves are not trustworthy. They're not even slightly trustworthy. They've got strong cryptographic properties that mean that their integrity can be verified, but the credentials themselves aren't worth anything. They're only worth as much as the person issuing them. I can issue a credential to you in the audience that you can fly a plane. I am not an authority to determine whether anyone can fly a plane. And if you present that at an airport, I hope they arrest both of us. So the example is that the DMV can issue licenses, which are credentials about driving, but they cannot issue degrees. They're not a university. The notion of a statement being in a credential in and of itself is not trustworthy. So what does that mean? Well, we can delegate our trust, and this is something that we do all the time anyway. In the DMV example, we can trust to some extent that somebody who has a driving license has achieved a qualification to drive a car of a certain type. And we can trust that not because we made them do a driving test, but we assume that they had to do a driving test to get the license. That our trust is in the DMV, not in the credential. We can have trust in auditors. So you can have an ISO auditor who is given their authority from a national level certification, and they can go out and certify other companies and industries that they are compliant to some sort of specification. That's a chain of trust, and our chains of trust can then become arbitrarily long. And because computers read them, it doesn't really matter. Compounding weight relationships is also something that's interesting. Prove your address via a driving license or 3 utility bills. A single utility bill doesn't give me enough confidence in your address, but if you present 3 of them, there's a weight of numbers there that becomes persuasive. Lastly, relationships are affected by trust relationships are affected by familiarity. So for instance, you have a bar in a college town that may decide that proof of age on the college ID is acceptable. A bar in the next town isn't going to take a college ID. A bar in the next state is definitely not going to take it, and a bar in another country isn't even going to understand what the ID is. And it's just to express that not all trust is created equal. You need to be understanding who is issuing what and why you trust them for that. So we're moving on to opportunities. One of the things that we notice is that the credentials themselves, in order for this space to work, need to be considered commodity software. Selling the commodity software is not necessarily a business you want to be in with some exceptions. So we need to think of solutions that drive efficiencies, productivity, and security. So for instance, agency staff being in dynamic access to resources. A consortium of banks doing know your customer KYC verifications may decide that there's a greater good in sharing that KYC assertion directly with their customer, because it brings down the cost for the entire industry. And if anyone who's seen the opening keynote might suspect, KYC is going to get really expensive. Security, verifiable credentials, just hand in glove with high security environments for authorization and authentication. And risk reduction. So interestingly, because we can have credentials with very short life cycles or that can be independently revoked, we reduce things like temporal threat. Technical lessons. Again, number one thing, the whole space doesn't work unless people can share credentials. That goes for the business side, but also the technical side. The horrible irony in this is that it's very hard to create a decentralized solution of any description unless you are a very powerful central authority, like a government or a monopoly. For those who aren't very powerful central authorities, community and standards organizations need to step in, are the way to do it. So for instance, something like OAuth comes from the community and standards. It isn't necessarily dictated by the state. And so I wanted to maybe share a different way that we can think about verifiable credentials, not just in the identity space, But from an engineering point of view in the enterprise space, if we consider the holder application to be a system of record for a given subject's assertions for any number of issuers, then verifiable credentials can be thought of as an integration solution between any number of systems bridged across the user plane. And this is a way to extend our thinking to backport it into the old-fashioned space. So on the left, you see 4, but it could be any number of issuing bodies for any number of types of credentials. In order to integrate with these solutions on the left, we need to know their identity, what we trust them for, and that's pretty much it. The existing way we do this on the right is that for each one of those integrations, we need an engineer to either handcraft that for the identity plane and for the resource plane. So another way to look at this space is as a very loosely coupled integration solution. So applying lessons learned, we first needed to look at where we were and look at where we wanted to be. These were the guiding stars we set out. We said we need to clearly define for our engineers at any given moment when they're trying to identify an answer to a solution, where do we point them? Workday are customer driven. Our customers get value from our applications. Our applications are actually our core customers, not external pseudo-technical credential administrators. We need to leverage our existing internal technology and be cost effective. So we needed to move from a SaaS to a PaaS platform. We needed to meet our customers where they are. So internally, people would say, but our solution's so easy to use. And that's true, but it doubles the amount of tooling that our engineers already need to use. Our engineers are used to use it directly working with configuration management systems, APIs, JSON payloads. They don't need very high quality software to do their job. We had built a sports car. And it's great. It did what it was supposed to do. It looked great doing it. What we needed was a tractor. Now, I don't know if people know this. Lamborghini also make tractors. The tractor on the bottom is also a Lamborghini. So we still get to make our Lamborghini, we just need to make the tractor. Because no matter how much we want to, we cannot plow a field with a sports car. The way we encapsulated this was a gateway pattern. We pulled all of the complexity in the space into a gateway, similar to an API gateway or an SMTP service for you don't necessarily want all these concepts to spread to the applications, you just want them to be able to interact with you. And then lastly, again, I need to hammer it home, it only makes sense if you can share the credentials. Workday are not a government, and we're not a monopoly, so it brings us to the community space. So working with Microsoft, Ping, Matter, IBM, people with skin in the game, people actively investing in the space, we tried to work out what is missing? And the answer is nothing. There's too many solutions. So the problem a lot of us had is that we would each do an implementation, and every implementation would meet a spec, but nothing could work together. There was so much optionality in the development and the implementation that to implement any one of the specifications in its entirety would bankrupt any company. So we needed to create a profile which stripped out all the optionality. And the approach there was good today is better than perfect tomorrow. Act 3 is yet to be written. In Act 3 of the hero's journey, the hero fights their greatest battle, their greatest challenge, and they go home forever changed. And this is still what I see is emerging in the community space right now. For clarity, in May this year, we took a step back from active research. We were happy that we could develop a solution for credentials. We had our gateway written, but we're customer driven, and our application teams are where we get our requirements from. We can't build cool technology. We can only build cool technology when our customers ask for it. Our platform is primed, but we're still waiting for the flywheel to start. Thank you. Questions? think this is, so I think the question for anyone who didn't hear it is, what is the driving factor for companies to invest in credentials and DIDs? That's very difficult to answer because it really depends on what the company wants to leverage from it. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make, is that we need to look at what the technology enables and find solutions that match that technology in terms of the fit, not just the cool technology. So we can think of many, many different things that they could do, but it's difficulty lifting it up. So for instance, proof of employment. It would be fairly straightforward for most employers to give an employee proof of employment that they can then share to LinkedIn. Nothing in it for the employer, but if it becomes so trivial for them to do, then it's also nothing stopping them. Does that answer your question? Yeah. It's tough because if you try to use this to replace existing solutions, things that work well, you're going to drive up your costs through the roof and achieve the exact same thing that you were at beforehand. It's identifying what are the novel solutions that you might be able to wring out of it. And so that's why I gave the example of like a consortium of banks working together to do KYC. Yeah, for sure. As soon as the government says do it, it will happen, because no one wants to not adhere. No one wants to go to prison, and no one wants to lose out on the possibility of working with governments because they have vast amounts of money. Sorry, there's another question.
I saw an ad as monopoly with two mobile operating systems.
Yeah.
So is that because of the secure capabilities of the phone? Or can you explain a little more about that as a monopoly?
Well, it's a monopoly or a monopsony, depending on which way you're looking at it. So they can either provide or consume credentials. And they are so ubiquitous in our day-to-day lives at this point that they sneeze and the world catches a cold kind of example. So if they were motivated, and we all hope they are, to work together to develop a generalized wallet solution, then that would bring the space forward. They're only really doing that under pressure from governments. So for instance, the monopsony example is health records. Apple Health Cards. If you want to do things like your COVID certs, you have to implement everything twice. Why? Because they're not working together, because they're not a standard, but they're both so large that why wouldn't you? It's like the early days of browsers, where everything needed to get coded a couple of times because, here to be unnamed, companies